Well, thank you all for coming and staying for the Lower Basin DCP panel. I think we're going to be a little bit more broad than that, but I'm Colby Pellegrino. I'm the Director of Water Resources for the Southern Nevada Water Authority. And with me today is Tom Buschatzke, the Director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources. And sitting in for Peter Nelson, we have Chris Harris, who's the Executive Director of the Colorado River Board of California. So with that, we're going to get started. The format of this panel is pretty loose. We're going to each give just a brief overview of what we are planning to focus on over the near term, and then obviously there's a follow-up panel where folks are going to be talking a little bit further about the long term. So I'm going to go first, and we'll cycle through this, and hopefully we'll have a couple minutes for questions at the end. And before I get started, I do want to thank Taylor for all of the effort, Taylor Hawes from the Nature Conservancy, she put in to creating this great morning program and wrangling all of us and trying repeatedly to get time on our calendars to make things work correctly. So wherever you are, Taylor, thank you. So I have something really embarrassing I have to admit first, and that is that I am a millennial. So I'm not text messaging, I wrote my notes on my phone. So in Southern Nevada, the first thing I'm going to talk about is our demand management program. As many of you know, there is no agriculture in Southern Nevada. All of our Colorado River water goes to municipal uses in this valley. And we focus all of our conservation efforts on outdoor water use. So to that end, when we look to the future and how we are going to adapt to climate change and shortages on the Colorado River, one of the first things we are working on and have really increased efforts over this last year is compliance with the watering schedules we've created for our water users. Those watering schedules restrict the days of weeks and times of day you can water to ensure that folks are not overwatering their lawns and landscapes. And so I'm going to ask that they play the first video we have here, which is part of our effort to get that compliance.
Reality check! If you overwater, you pay for it. Only water 1 day a week. I think these are yours. Woo! Reality check! There are big fines if you don't change your watering clock.
Good to know.
Just a friendly reminder. Ryan Reeves style.
So for those of you who may not know, we have a hockey team in Las Vegas now. And they've been a great community partner, and they were really excited to participate in this ad campaign with us. It is a little audacious, but that's the point, is when somebody's watching the TV, we need to have them remember the next time they're in their garage and they see their watering clock that there's something they're supposed to do with it. And this time of year, we recommend 1 day a week watering. Just to put a finer point on this water compliance metric, through the use of our AMR meter reading data, where we can look at in 15-minute increments our customers' water use, we've been able to quantify that a 15% overall increase in compliance with our watering schedule would yield us 19,500 acre-feet of consumptive use water savings. So it's really important in this community that we remind people what to do with their landscape in order to help benefit our water resources and, in turn, the Colorado River. The next video that I'm going to show is another part of this campaign, but it's focused on the second strategic arena we have related to demand management, which is what we call non-functional turf. So we've gone out, we've measured all of the turf within the valley. This is not turf agricultural Bermuda grass being grown in Imperial or Yuma. This is the grass in people's yards, parks, commercials, centers, things like that. And the simplest definition of non-functional turf is turf that is only being walked on by the guy that mows it. So of about 12,500 acres of turf in this valley, we estimate that about 5,000 acres is non-functional. And if we were able to remove all of that non-functional turf, we would save over 37,000 acre-feet of water each year. So if you could play the next video.
What are you doing?
Well, I noticed you love watering grass where grass has no business growing, so I figured.
Oh, that's nice.
Remove useless grass.
You guys like that one? You can share it on our social media. But again, the point there is there's a significant amount of water to be saved in changing the culture of water use within this valley. So when the other states talk about demand management and the things they're doing, it's a little bit different than what's going on here, but in the same way, this is our local demand management effort right now. So now I'm going to shift and talk a little bit closer to the Colorado River and what we're doing to look ahead and prepare essentially for what comes next in the renegotiation of the guidelines. Like a lot of other folks have said, we've just really inked DCP. We haven't even seen how it performs yet. So we're still making some of those observations, but there's a lot we're doing in the planning world to try to prepare ourselves for what's coming over the next several years. The first thing that I'll mention is we made a major change to our water resource plan this year. And for the first time ever, our 50-year water resource plan looks at specific hydrologic traces that are projected from the Bureau of Reclamation's CRSS model. That's the Colorado River Simulation System model. And tying that to a scenario of how we would actually meet the demands under those specific hydrologic conditions. We look at 4 of them, ranging with a long-term average flow of Colorado River water ranging from 14.7 to 12.9 million acre-feet over 50 years. So we're in that 12.9 million acre-foot scenario, which we call our climate change scenario, where we look at the water resources we have to meet this community. That's low, not just relative to the hydrology that we've seen today. That's less water than we've seen come through in this current drought. But it is getting to be in the lower quartile of the climate change projections for the Colorado River. So it's a pretty severe stress test for our water resource portfolio, and I think a very important step that we're taking in planning to make sure we have enough water to meet Southern Nevada's needs. To that end, we're also looking at some other modeling, and we have been for a while. Part of the guidelines being temporary was that the states knew they had things to learn. We'd never operated the river in this way, and there were specific issues we were trying to resolve, and we wanted to have a check back on whether or not these things were effective. And the guidelines have become a bad word in some ways. But I want to go back to the major controversy that really pushed us into the guidelines. And that was at the beginning of this drought, as lake levels declined, and we saw those really, really low inflows in 2000 to 2004. There was a dispute between the upper and lower basins about how much water would be released from Lake Powell. And an undertone to that dispute was how the lower basin was going to handle shortages when we got there. And what came out of that in the guidelines was addressing the 2 major issues that were playing out amongst the states: how we were going to release water from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, and how we were going to share shortages on the river. So speaking just to how we release water from Lake Powell to Lake Mead, there was a new set of criteria that we had never looked at before that had these things called balancing releases, where an 8.23 release was what was mandated until we tipped into more serious flood control release for the most part, and no reductions on the low end. And so these balancing releases were thought to relieve some of the controversy that was out there surrounding whether the upper basin and Lake Powell should release more water as we headed into this drought. We thought that would resolve some conflict, and I don't really think it did. I think we came together and we all agreed that that's how we would do it. But the number of 9 million acre foot releases that have come from Lake Powell to Lake Mead were not anticipated. Sure, they were buried within the probabilities, and I'm sure there's some scenario that showed that. But at the technical level, it's created a little bit of mistrust. And are we gaming the system to get that extra water out? Are we changing the way we're using water within the lower basin to manipulate the release from the upper basin? And to that end, even before the DCP was finished, Southern Nevada had started looking at are there ways that the release could be more effective without creating this sort of animosity between the basins. And maybe the balancing release wasn't the best way to get that accomplished. Sounded like a good idea at the time, perhaps something that we need to revisit in the future. Another thing that we looked at and we started to contemplate when the DCP was created, very much in the same way that prior to the 07 guidelines, the upper basin didn't care a lot about the lower basin's water use patterns. But then when it meant in a balancing release more water coming out of the reservoir, they got very concerned with our behavior. And now that's a little bit flipped when we look at demand management and things like that, and the way that the upper basin wants to move water around within the crisp reservoirs to help manage their water supply situation. That brings the level of lower basin scrutiny that wasn't there. So we would like to explore ways that instead of looking at just the storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead, we look more holistically at the storage in the system. And the end goal for us being that we become agnostic to how the upper basin manages their water amongst their reservoirs. And if we had something that wasn't just tied to Lake Powell, but for example, included the storage in all of the reservoirs, that would mean their decisions for how to move water between those reservoirs have no impact on us. And similarly, that could be done for the lower basin by looking instead of just at Lake Mead, looking at Lake Mojave and Lake Havasu and the storage there as well. So those are just a couple of the things that our modeling team is continuing to explore and trying to see what the impacts of those things might be. And just a few housekeeping items that I'm sure some of these guys are much more informed of and will talk about. But we are, as Steve mentioned, they're looking at the programs in the upper basin for the environment. The Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program is also taking a hard look at what sort of programmatic compliance the lower basin needs in order to be prepared for what might be in the future. One of the things that was really beneficial to everyone that participated in the 07 guidelines was that the species compliance necessary for those actions was taken care of before we even stepped into the negotiating room because the LCR MSCP existed. And we want that program to be there and to be flexible enough and encompassing enough that we have that same situation when we ultimately decide what the river will look like post-2026. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Colby. I'm going to talk about the Drought Contingency Plan, Arizona Implementation Plan, and maybe a little bit of view where I see us going out for next steps. I will try not to say anything that will give me a 2-minute unsportsmanlike penalty or a game misconduct ending up in the penalty box. And thankfully we got DCP done so that the commissioner didn't have to put me in the penalty box. So we have big challenges in Arizona with the Drought Contingency Plan and the incremental impacts on our water users. And the only way Arizona Arizona could sign on to the drought contingency plan was with legislative authority for the director, me, to do so. So along with Ted Cook and General Manager of CAP, we stood up a steering committee with stakeholders. I think one of the keys to that steering committee was we had legislative leadership from both houses and both parties as active members of that committee. There were breakout groups where much of the real work was done, and the committee, I think, put the finishing touches on it, and it got us across the finishing line. But what we had to do is we had to have a mitigation plan for those who were incrementally impacted in a way that they didn't think they would be under the 2007 guidelines. So that mitigation plan included potentially financial compensation for some of the reductions, but more importantly, some water deliveries with water supplies that CAP held as intentionally created surplus in Lake Mead. So at the same time, we're trying to prop up the elevations of Lake Mead with the DCP. We were going to take some water out of the lake to mitigate impacts on our water users, agriculture, tribes, and cities. So we created an offset program to try to put at least as much water into the lake through conservation as we were going to take out of the lake for mitigation. Happy to say, with no Tier 1 shortage in 2020, the mitigation component doesn't need to be met at least in 2020. Nevertheless, we're moving forward with the offset component. And under that plan, the Gila River community has created 117,000 acre-feet of intentionally created surplus in 2019. So even before we get into the first operational year, we're taking actions that were facilitated and incentivized by the DCP. The federal government is also paying the Gila River community for 100,000 acre-feet of ICS to help meet their firming goals for Colorado River water for tribal water settlements. The Arizona Water Banking Authority, who has a firming obligation to the Gila River community, has created 14,600 acre-feet of ICS by the community for about $3.5 million. The Colorado Indian tribes have committed over 3 years to do 50,000 acre-feet of system conservation each year. In 2020, their water order reflects a reduction or a creation of ICS of system conservation, of 32,820 acre-feet, and the state's paying them $7.7 million to do that. So we've already moving full steam ahead on implementation of the DCP. And of course, the flexibility that DCP has created in terms of being able to have ICS that is not as likely to be stranded in the lake as it was under the 2007 guidelines is a key component of our ability to do this offset program and to have folks step up to the plate and put their water into the mix. Another important part of the program was to help the CAP agricultural users be able to pump a little bit more groundwater. They have that absolute right under the 1980 Groundwater Management Act to do so, but the state is funding some additional pumping their well production and infrastructure, and the state, on behalf of those districts, has recently applied for a grant with the Natural Resource Conservation Service of the Department of Ag under the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. That application went into the federal government on December 3rd. So lots of steps are moving forward, all positive steps. The Drought Contingency Plan was a great step forward for Arizona. The legislative package that was passed on January 31st of 2019 was signed in the room that the 1980 Groundwater Management Act was signed. That was something that was very important to Governor Ducey, sending that message that the DCP was as important as that landmark groundwater legislation in the state of Arizona. As part of that legislative package, the governor signed an executive order creating the Governor's Water Augmentation, Innovation, and Conservation Council. And that's really about the future of Arizona. And that council has several committees that it has stood up, and it's important work to be done for the future of the state. Those committees include desalination of brackish groundwater within the state, a long-term augmentation committee, a post-2025 active management area committee. So the Groundwater Management Act created management areas. DWR has a responsibility to create plans through 2025. We need to look at what we're going to do past 2025 and learn lessons from where we are under that process and where we need to be out into the future. And then a non-AMA groundwater committee, where we're starting to see in certain areas of the state groundwater levels dropping, domestic wells drying up, lots of new farming going in areas where there's really no regulation or little regulation. So again, that committee has legislative participation, learning that lesson from the drought contingency plan. So important steps moving forward. Okay. So I also want to talk a little bit about how important the drought contingency plan was in my mind to keeping the collaborative nature that Commissioner Berman spoke about in her speech a few minutes ago. And that collaborative nature has managed to survive for the last 20 or so years at least across different federal administrations. And again, the guts of the drought contingency plan in the lower basin were negotiated with Commissioner Lopez in the Obama administration, and we closed the loop with the Trump administration with Commissioner Berman. So I think it was really important to point out that we were able to keep that momentum going, and we hope to see that continue out into the future, regardless of the politics in DC and who's in power in the legislature or in the Congress or as the president. I'll also point out for Arizona, one of the important outcomes of the drought contingency plan, I think this was a key in the lower basin drought contingency plan development process, was we traded off flexibility for entities to intentionally create surplus and take it out of the lake, even at levels below the first shortage tier under the 2007 guidelines. In return, we got a commitment from the 3 states to take collective actions and absolutely protect elevation 1020 in Lake Mead. To me, that was the major breakthrough in the negotiations when we set that as a policy goal. So the flexibility and the backstop, the flexibility and the certainty was kind of the guiding principles as we came up with the drought contingency plan. And I think moving forward, it will be important to Arizona, again, to continue to seek that same kind of flexibility on the one side and certainty on the other side, that real draconian shortages are going to totally wipe out Arizona moving into the future. So, a little bit about where I see the next steps going. The Commissioner talked about the review of both the guidelines and the drought contingency plan. That is an important next step. Ted Cook and I have taken it upon ourselves to continue to reach out as we prepare in Arizona for that review and for the quote-unquote renegotiation for the operating system that will be in place past 2026. But we're continuing to reach out to our steering committee delegates one by one to keep the momentum going that we created last spring and to prepare Arizona for discussions with the federal government and the states moving forward. That'll be a relatively long process, maybe culminating somewhere the end of the first quarter of next year. I also see that in the next steps, it will be important to Arizona that the Basin states continue what I see as a unique role with the federal government. We recognize and embrace the need for all stakeholders to be involved, the tribes, the NGOs, others. But we still see a very unique relationship between the states and reclamation, and we want to continue that relationship that we have built over the years. So that will be one, I think, of the guiding principles, so to speak, that Arizona will be looking forward to putting in play as we move forward. steps. I also want to mention the importance of having Mexico be part of the DCP, the Binational Water Scarcity Plan. I was fortunate enough to be part of the minute negotiating team that negotiated Minute 323. Spent lots of hours working on those issues with Mexico. And I think we have a great new partner. And when the reductions kick in for DCP in 2020, Mexico is going to be taking reductions as well. And they are creating some more conserved water in Lake Mead through a whole bunch of different projects that they've been working on. So, and I think I've said this before, I think where the basin is heading, we need all hands on deck in the next steps, like we needed all hands on deck in the drought contingency plan. So I'm looking forward in that regard to moving forward, and I think one of the challenges will be the length of time it takes to negotiate the next steps, the next set of guidelines, if we want to call them that. The drought contingency plan negotiations actually started in June of 2013. And we started with a lower basin and upper basin in the same room. Colby and Chris were there. It was at the staff level, not the principal level at that point. Lots of ups and downs. Pilot system conservation program got stood up. The memorandum of understanding got stood up until we ended up back in the room at the principal level in July of 2015 as the lower basin and then the upper basin continued to work on their drought contingency plan, and all of that coming back together at the end of 2018 and into 2019. So I think that challenge will be the folks who negotiated even the DCP in both the upper and lower basin are changing out. Colorado, Utah, Back to the Future a little bit, but John D'Antoni, New Mexico, wasn't directly involved in DCP. And we're fortunate to have kept Pat Terrell at least through May for Wyoming. Same thing in the lower basin. We already have seen Kevin Kelly retire at IID. Kevin was instrumental in getting Imperial Irrigation as far as they did get, and we need them back in the fold from my perspective as well. So there will be challenges as we move forward, and I'm looking forward to having the review done and then starting to work on those next steps. And with that, I will conclude.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado River Board, and I'm here pinch hitting for Peter, who is definitely under the weather right now. So obviously I don't have a presentation. I spent the last hour trying to knock together some thoughts, and I was a little tardy getting up here to join my colleagues. But I do want to share kind of California's perspectives and some of my own thoughts on both the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan and, as Tom and Colby have said, kind of looking ahead our next steps in development of the next set of guidelines. And first of all, I thought I'd start with a reminiscence related to CRWUA. And, you know, I was thinking with Jerry Zimmerman out there a couple hours ago, I think my first CRWUA that I came to was 93. I know many of you have been here way before that, but 93 it's a long time ago. And a lot has happened in our basin that I think we should continually try and remind ourselves about. We've done a lot of good work, and I know we've got some significant challenges ahead, and I'm going to touch on some of those. But one thing that really jumped out at me was there was kind of a weird alignment that occurred in 2000. On December 12th, 2000, in El Paso, Texas, we executed Minute 306. And that really ushered in a new era of cooperation and collaboration with our neighboring country to the south, Mexico. And it laid out a process to work binationally in looking at feasibility studies for potential environmental enhancement actions down in the Delta region. And this is kind of the first time ever the states had been involved in this sort of a discussion that was sort of outside of just the rigid water supply management framework that existed within IBWC, US IBWC, and CELA. And it really, I think, as I said, ushered in a new era. But at the same time, in 2000, we entered one of the worst periods of drought in the Colorado River Basin. And in fact, that period, 2000 to 2004, the average annual natural flow at Lee Ferry was, I think, 9.5 million acre feet it averaged. And that got everybody's attention. And in fact, we went from nearly full reservoir conditions in the two large mainstream reservoirs, 1999-2000, to 48% combined capacity of Powell and Meade in 2004. So that got everybody's attention for sure. And this, dealing with these changed hydrologic conditions really was the impetus for all of us getting together as a basin, all of us, the stakeholders, north and south, in working on what became the 2007 interim guidelines. And you know, I have to say, looking at the period that we have right now of implementation of the guidelines, they've worked pretty well. We've had starts and fits in the thing, but largely we were able to stabilize the two large mainstream reservoirs during this period of relatively sustained drought. And I think that's a credit to all of us and our ability to work together collaboratively with reclamation in ensuring that we could take any and all actions during this period of time to manage both those reservoirs in the most efficient and effective fashion possible. And during the period 2000 to 2019, we had the second, third, fourth, and fifth lowest years of record in that. And we were still able to meet our treaty obligation to Mexico and meet downstream demands. We had the lower basin states contributing significant supplies through intentionally created surplus and storing that water in Lake Mead to the benefit of the system. At the same time, and I'll just kind of swing my focus over to California, we stayed pretty busy. We've been doing a lot. And even well before the 2000s, in the 90s, we had aggressive conservation programs over both in the ag sector, in the Imperial Valley, and the Coachella Valley, as well as significant municipal actions and programs conserving supplies, similar to what Colby illustrated for the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Just as a few examples, IID, since 2003, the implementation of the Quantification Settlement Agreement has conserved 5.8 million acre feet. San Diego County Water Authority has spent billions on expanding its water supply portfolio. They constructed the Carlsbad desalination plant. They've implemented significant recycled water programs, and they've also developed their QSA transfers from the Imperial Valley over to the San Diego region. Metropolitan is currently conserving something like 1.6 million acre feet within its service area, recycled water, recovered groundwater, etc., turf removal, as well as their Colorado River programs, which they have both in the Imperial Valley and the Palo Verde Valley. PVID last year conserved 100,000 acre feet or actually this year, excuse me, in 2019, and has the capability, if necessary, to fallow up to 1/3 of the irrigated acreage within its service area. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, here's a city that has reduced its demand below that of where it was in the 1970s with the addition of over 1 million new residents. And finally, the Coachella Valley Water District continues to replenish its groundwater basins. To date, they've banked something in excess of 4 million acre feet in its basins within its service area. But some of this conservation has come at a price. We all know this. And part of the reason why we're in this room is that we're all connected to the Colorado River. Just as the CAP is connected to the Colorado River, the Colorado River Aqueduct is connected to the river. The Salton Sea is connected to the river. And I always have to stop and try and put myself in the shoes of someone who lives in the Imperial Valley when you have a shrinking body of water there that's exposing playa. They estimate 50,000 acres of playa by 2028. and the lake is becoming hypersaline, so the fish are dying. The piscivorous birds that fed on those fish are leaving. But the real issue there is it's a public health issue now. It's become an air quality issue. And frankly, Imperial County has the highest childhood asthma rate in the nation. This is something that they deal with on a daily basis, and we just need to understand that our actions in the Colorado River Basin, there are both intended and unintended consequences. Now, the Newsom administration has come in. They've taken a very aggressive step forward to addressing and implementing the Salton Sea Management Plan Phase 1 10-year plan. $400 million plan right now, and it's almost fully funded. I think they're about $100 million light, but they're working on that. And I guess I would urge all of us in the basin to support, in the extent practical and possible, the efforts of the California administration, the California agencies, in ensuring that we achieve a smaller but sustainable sea going forward. That's to all of our benefit, and clearly it's to IID's benefit, and I agree with Tom. We've got to get IID back in the DCP game and moving forward with all of us as a family. We're all in this basin together. We're connected. And as Tom illustrated, in 2013 and 2014, we started with the outside-the-box thinking, and that then devolved into a smaller group in 2014, particularly lower basin principles. We were concerned that perhaps the guidelines weren't going to go far enough, that we were going to continue to take Lake Mead down to critical elevations that just weren't sustainable. And hence the DCP process came out. We executed and implemented those agreements in 2019. They're in place. And I also want to echo what Tom said about our collaborative partnership with Mexico. If you'll recall, in 2017 in Santa Fe, we executed Minute 323, which had the binational water scarcity contingency plan. They executed their DCP before we did. That's the nature of our good relationship with Mexico. They believed in us. They trusted us that we would get the job done, and we did. Took us a few extra months. We had to continue to work. We had some hitches in our giddy-up, but we did get it done. And I think that's to all of our benefit, getting this overlay on the guidelines with the DCP in place. It's going to give us another 7 some odd years of operational experience where we can evaluate how well did the DCP do to help us protect reservoir elevations in both Powell and Meade. Continue to incentivize conservation, both in the upper basin, development of a demand management program, if practical, down the road, but clearly continuing the robust activities that we have in the lower basin. I think the other thing I really want to highlight in closing is the Arizona intrastate DCP experience is something all of us should take a very hard look at. The work that Tom and the team in Arizona put into getting that deal done and getting the governor and the Arizona legislature to sign off on it was monumental. And I think a key part was the relationship that DWR and CAP were able to develop with their tribes, both mainstream tribes and CAP tribes. And I think as we look ahead in the guidelines, we have to, and Tom said it, we have to look to our tribal nations within the Colorado River Basin. We can't solve all the problems on the back of all of the water users in the basin, including the tribes, but I think all of us together can find sustainable solutions that may work for us. There are opportunities there, and I think that the hard work that Tom and Ted Cook did in putting that Arizona DCP together should be a great example and incentive to the rest of us as we move forward and start thinking about the types of agreements that we're going to need to craft and develop going forward. And I also concur wholeheartedly with Tom. I think Mexico needs to be with us from the get-go on this. They're an important piece of this. They're connected to the Colorado River, and they've been such a great partner for all of us and a collaborator. We have a boatload of uncertainty ahead of us, folks. Climate change, change hydrologic conditions, what does that mean for our water supply? We already have a 2012 Basin study that illustrated clearly the supply-demand imbalance that we have. And we have a tribal basin study that lays out what the needs are and desires of the Native American tribes within the basin. With this kind of information and other data and information that we need to develop between now and when we start this negotiation process, where are we? What are the status of all the uses and losses in the basin? Better hydrology, developing additional forecasting skill, other modeling tools that help expand our portfolio and our toolbox. Those are the things that we're going to need as we all collectively as a basin move forward into this next period. I think, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there's a feeling I have, given listening to Brad Udall and Jack Schmidt and Jonathan Overpeck, this period that we're entering into might be about as important as maybe even when the compact commissioners sat down and started working. We're at one of those kind of cusp points where I think we really need to put our best foot forward, bring best science to bear, and involve all stakeholders to the extent practical and possible. I think I'll leave it there, Colby.
All right. Thank you, Chris. We are a little ahead of schedule, so I'm going to ask a question or two of my panelists more for just information. First off, because I think not everyone in the room might be aware, and I face commonly when I go out and speak this notion that the lower basin is never going to back down on their water use. So I'd like each of you to talk about how much water you're using this year and what you think you're going to use next year.
Well, I'll start.
I don't know.
This year, I think California is going to come in below 4 million acre feet. So, not entirely sure how next year will play out. We'll see. People need to put together their water orders. But I believe this year, by the end of the calendar year, will be the lowest amount of mainstream water taken by the state of California since the early 1950s.
So with the conservation programs that we did as part of DCP and some other conservation CAPs doing, I think it's somewhere around 2.5 million this year for Arizona. I would expect it to be in that ballpark again next year. We're taking the 192,000 acre feet of DCP reduction. And we'll continue to do some of the conservation programs that we committed to doing for our offset program and our Arizona implementation plan.
And I'll just round that out by saying our use this year is projected to be 236,000 acre feet of our 300,000. It actually would have been a little lower, but we made a commitment to Arizona to share some of our capacity to create ICS this year. And in doing so, we were projecting some really low numbers and worried that we were going to exceed capacity. So we backed off on our local groundwater pumping to the tune of about 14,000 acre feet. So if that 14,000 acre feet had not been reduced in our groundwater pumping, our Colorado River use would have ended up about 222 this year, which would put us online for the lowest water use we've had in modern history as well. So I'll ask one more question, and I know that Chris hit on this, but what are you guys collectively doing with the tribes in your states, and how do you think that'll fold into what we're doing in the future?
So we had, I think, 3 or 4 tribes that were delegates to the steering committee, so we'll be reaching out to them as we prepare for the review and the next steps. And we continue to work with the tribes who've committed resources to the offset program. We have other venues where we interact with the tribes, especially in the Indian water rights settlement arena. We probably have 4 or 5 settlement talks actively underway, and we have a Wallapai tribal settlement that is sitting in Congress and trying to get that over the finish line. Those tribal settlements give us more certainty. A lot of them involve awards of CAP water as part of the settlement water budget portfolio. So those will be important as well, knowing what we have available to us, and I think it will create opportunities to partner with the tribes for things like intentionally created surplus. The Healer Indian Community settlement is what allowed that to happen, and I talked about the big numbers of ICS that they've created in 2019. So lots of work to be done, but lots of opportunity there with our tribes.
I think the same thing with the state of California too. Myself, as well as many of the agencies, are involved in ongoing dialogues and discussions, both through the Water and Tribes Initiative that it has been going on for some time now. University of Arizona, Kathy Jacobs, her Colorado River Conversations Project has been good too. That's brought together many of the Basin's tribes. And I think all of us, like I said earlier, as we go forward in not only evaluating the effectiveness of the existing 07 guidelines, but thinking about what worked, what didn't, where we want to go in the future. I think that's where improving this dialogue and listening to the tribes in the basin is going to lead us to places and opportunities such as Arizona was able to find in its DCP process.
All right, and with that, we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'll open it up if anybody has a question to ask. No brave souls out there. Well, I want to thank my fellow panelists here, and thank you all for the opportunity to come speak to you and tell you what we're working on.
Thanks, Colby. Good job, Dad.